Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your yearly horoscope forecast for the zodiac sign of Libra for the entire year ahead of 2022. If you're new to my channel, then my name is Chris Brennan, and I'm the host of the Astrology podcast and the author of a book on ancient astrology titled Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune. So in my approach, I synthesize a little bit of ancient and a little bit of modern astrology in order to get the best of both worlds. So each week I release new podcasts and videos on astrology on my channel. So if you'd like to get notifications when I release a new video, then please hit the subscribe button here on YouTube. And if you enjoy this video, then please consider hitting the like button to show me that you enjoyed the content and you'd like to see more of it. Okay, so my horoscopes are primarily meant to be read relative to your rising sign or your ascendant sign, which are essentially the same things. Although you can also watch them from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you're born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if you're born at night. So the rising sign changes signs every hour or two during the course of the day, whereas the moon sign takes about 2 days to change signs, and the sun sign takes about a month to change signs. So as a result of that, the rising sign is much more personally relevant to you, and for that reason, I would really focus on that when you're looking at these horoscopes, or horoscopes in general for that matter. So if you don't know what your rising sign is, then all you need to do is find out your birth time and then go to a website where you can get your birth chart calculated, such as astro.com, and you should be able to get your ascendant or your birth rising sign calculated on those websites. So I have a video tutorial titled How to Calculate Your Ascendant and Rising Sign on my channel, which you can either search for or I'll put a link to it in the upper corner of this video right here. So let me know in the comments below what your sun, moon, and rising signs are, and which sign resonates with you more when you watch your video horoscopes like this one. All right, Libra, let's jump into it and look at your transits for 2022. So here's a diagram that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. Here's some of the points that I want to touch on, starting with the Venus retrograde, which has already begun by the time we start 2022, but it's going to last well into, I think, the first couple of months, not really being finished until Venus leaves Capricorn, which is the sign it's retrograde in right now, on March 6th. So this is something to pay attention to for the first couple of months of 2022. So Venus is going retrograde in Capricorn, which for Libra and Libra rising is your fourth house of home, family, living situation, and your private life in general. So a Venus retrograde can have to do with bringing up some intense dynamics, especially relational dynamics, when it comes to typically in the fourth house, either your parents and your relationship with your parents or your family more broadly, or secondarily, your home and your living situation, whatever that means for you. So because Venus went retrograde in December conjunct Pluto, that can indicate kind of an intense energy, an intense exchange, where sometimes it can dredge up some things from the past, or it can bring up some pretty intense relational dynamics in terms of your parents and your relationship with them, or in terms of your home and your living situation. So sometimes this can be a good thing. It can dredge up things from the past in order to address them and bring them into light in the present so that you can move forward. Sometimes this can be bringing up things that happened 8 years ago, because that was the last time that Venus went retrograde in Capricorn in the same sector of your chart, in the fourth house, because Venus will basically do that approximately every 8 years. So 8 years back, or 16, or 24, depending on how old you are, you may see some repetitions or some echoes of themes that happened in the past coming up during this time. So what else happens with Venus and Pluto? Greater focus and greater attention and activity taking place when it comes to your home and living situation. Sometimes this can be something as simple as like redecorating or reorganizing your home and living situation in some way. A retrograde, and especially a station, can just signify an important turning point when it comes to the topics of that house, and it doesn't necessarily have to be negative, but it does usually have some quality of reviewing or revising things, or revisiting or renegotiating things, all sorts of rewords, whereas Venus itself is the planet of relationships, beautification, and interaction with other people. So it sometimes forces us to confront and address some of the relationships that we have, the one-on-one relationships, and whether there's certain things that aren't quite going the way that they need to go and need to be revised in some way. This is a great opportunity to do that. So this is going to actually intensify a little bit, and the pace of things is going to pick up towards the end of January, because what happens is that the planet Mars is actually going to move or ingress into the sign of Capricorn and into your fourth house starting on January 24th. And there it's going to sort of catch up to Venus and conjoin Venus, and Mars isn't going to be finished transiting through that sign until it leaves and moves into Aquarius on March 6th, which happens to be the same day that Venus also departs from that sign. So that's when the full Venus retrograde period will be over, is once Venus completely departs from your fourth house of home, living situation, and your private life. So with Mars ingressing into that sign, it can pick up and speed up the pace of events. So suddenly things are moving much faster, and you may find yourself having to work on things when it comes to your home and your living situation, or things related to your parents, like your relationship with them. So sometimes it can just be a period of heightened activity where you're having to put more concerted effort into that area of your life. Other times, Mars can kind of like raise the temperature or the heat in that area of your life, and it can lead to things becoming not just more hectic, but sometimes more tense. And sometimes there can be in situations where there's like not just anxiety, but conflict or strife, or even a severing or separation coming up as archetypal themes in this area of your life when you have a Mars transit through the fourth house. So that's going to be, the more challenging significations are going to be less the case for those with night charts and will probably be more constructive. Whereas for those with day charts, I would expect some of those more acute and a little bit more challenging significations to potentially come to the forefront. So that's something to pay attention to there. As with all Mars transits, one of the things you can do is just be a little bit careful about being impetuous or impulsive when it comes to actions related to the fourth house and your home and living situation, or alternatively your parents and family, because sometimes when we get really heated, in the heat of an argument, things can be said that you later regret, or that can lead to a falling out or a separation. And in some instances, once you cool down, you can kind of regret that you said certain things in the heat of the moment. So one piece of advice is just to be a little bit careful about that as a potential, because as long as you're aware of it, you may be able to mitigate some of the worst outcomes that could come about just through your own actions. All right, so that transit is the first one I wanted to focus on this year, and it lasts until March 6th. The other one I wanted to talk about is Jupiter moving into Pisces, which is your sixth house. So here's the circular chart again. So Pisces is your sixth house of work and health. And Jupiter is generally a planet of growth and expansion. So it should represent some relatively positive things moving into your sixth house of work and health. So for some people, this can be growth in the job sphere. It can mean getting a new job, or it could indicate a promotion in a current job that you already have, or entering some sort of relatively positive or optimistic phase of your work life. If you find yourself in a managerial role, or if you own your own business, the sixth place is also the place of people that help you or people that work for you, people in a subservient role. So it can sometimes indicate having a positive relationship or hiring somebody that really helps you out and does a good job and helps sort of manage your workplace in a more positive fashion. The only thing to be careful about when it comes to that is that Jupiter is going to meet up with the planet Neptune, and conjoin Neptune in Pisces around April 12th. And so the issue with that is that Neptune can sometimes be kind of a illusory planet that indicates things that look really good but aren't necessarily very substantive, or have a quality of not being quite what they seem to be at first. So on the best case scenario, sometimes that just makes something look really good. Even if it's not quite as good as what it seemed at first, it still can be okay. But you want to be careful of the more extreme downside, which can be issues of like deception or people putting themselves forward as something that they're not, or pretending to be something that they're not. So if this is something that comes up in the workplace, it's just something to watch out for in terms of the potential for deception. Although for many of you, that like worst case scenario isn't necessarily going to be the case. And instead it could just be a relatively pleasant and positive and optimistic time, even if once you get to the other side of it, things were not quite as positive as it looked like they were going to be at first. The other thing to mention about the sixth house is health and what it takes to maintain and improve your health. So Jupiter through the sixth house can be a great period for improving your health and identifying areas where you have something that you'd like to improve or like to work on, and actually being able to be successful in doing that. So sometimes this can be as a result of getting good advice. For example, sometimes when we go and get medical advice, sometimes it works out better or worse for different reasons that are sort of outside of your control. But this is a period in which attempting to get help for health-related matters, or to improve one's diet or otherwise general approach to health, could be relatively positive and successful during this time. So some people, for example, start going to the gym or start a workout routine, or just generally doing things in order to improve and maintain a better overall sense of health. So this transit is going to be mainly prominent the first 4 months of this year until the middle of May, and then it'll come back just a little bit later this year, October 28th through December 20th. So that's the Jupiter transit through your sixth house. After that, Jupiter actually ingresses into Aries on May 10th, which is your seventh house of relationships. So this means that the planet of growth and expansion is moving into the sector of your chart that indicates relationships, both romantic as well as professional one-on-one relationships where you work very closely with a partner or have some sort of direct partnership with somebody. So in terms of romantic relationships, this can either be a great period to start new relationships, or in which you see that new relationships start to grow and blossom. Or alternatively, if you're already in a relationship, it can signify just a new period in your relationship, or a new chapter in your relationship where things start going particularly well, or in which your partner's doing well and is in a relatively successful and optimistic space, which then reflects positively back on your life at the same time. So if you're in the market for relationships, it can be a good time to look for one. And if you're not, or if this is more pertaining to business partnerships, then it would, generally speaking, be a pretty good time to start some partnerships or work closely one-on-one with another person. So that transit is primarily taking place between May 10th and October 28th, although then it's going to come back at the very end of the year from December 20th until May of 2023. So it's kind of off and on over the course of the next year and a half or so, which is pretty great. All right, so the next transit after that seventh house transit of Jupiter through Aries is, I wanted to talk about Saturn transiting through the second half of Aquarius, because we're getting towards the end of this entire Saturn in Aquarius transit, which started almost 2 years ago now and really got going, especially 1 year ago in December of 2020. So this Saturn transit has been going through Aquarius, which is your fifth house. So let me show the diagram that shows the significations of the houses. The fifth house pertains to things like traditionally children, creativity, pleasure, also sex, and other things related to sex are fifth house topics. So, with Saturn going through your fifth house, this can be a time of restructuring when it comes to this area of your life and restructuring either your relationship with the topic of children, either your own children if you have any, or other people's children, and just like the concept of children in general in your life. For example, I knew like a client once who was like a children's book writer that had major fifth house placements going on. So sometimes it can just be the topic of children as a general concept in your life. So restructuring your thoughts and relationship with children, also sometimes restructuring things related to creativity and the ways in which you express yourself creatively in your life, and perhaps putting more structure into that in a way that's more deliberate than at other times in your life. And then finally, also redefining your relationship with sex and sexuality and romantic relationships in general in some way. So maybe this is a more serious period of your life. Sometimes Saturn transits can bring sort of obstacles that come up that are either surmountable difficulties in this area of your life. So it's like one of those things where an obstacle comes up, but through great striving and effort, you're able to overcome that, and you end up coming out the other side of the transit stronger as a result of it, having learned and sort of improved yourself in ways that maybe you wouldn't have done initially if you weren't forced to for some reason. So that's one scenario with Saturn transits. That's the more positive scenario. The other scenario is sometimes Saturn can put up a roadblock or a stop sign where you've been proceeding down this path in a certain path in your life, in this area of your life of children, creativity, sexuality, but then you reach a stop sign and you find out that you can't proceed further down this specific path for some reason. And in some scenarios, you reach this stop sign where it says that you can't proceed further, and it's not a sort of negotiable, surmountable difficulty, but instead it's a non-negotiable one, in which case sometimes you have to find a different path or go a different direction. So I've seen some instances, for example, where people run into issues with the topic of children, like issues conceiving children, or if they have older children, running into difficulties in terms of their relationship with children, or perhaps their children running into some difficulties during this time in their own life, which is simply being reflected in your chart. In other instances, it can be running into issues in terms of sex and sexuality, and perhaps needing to have that be a part of your life where there isn't as much focus, or in which you sort of pull back for a period of time. But the good news is that whatever this period is, and whatever this transit is about for you, it's something that does have a definite end point, which is that Saturn is going to depart from Aquarius in March of 2023. So this is the last year of this transit. So that means that there is an endpoint in sight, and we're already about halfway through the transit at this point. So whatever some of these topics or themes that are supposed to come up for you in this area of your life at this time, they're probably things that already started coming up and that you've already got some inkling about, if not some full-on knowledge that you're already like working through and dealing with this. Because the transit started first back in, let's say, March and April of 2020, and then in earnest starting in December of 2020 when Saturn fully moved into Aquarius permanently for the last time. So I did want to mention, though, the Mars transit, because when Mars ingresses into Aquarius on March 6th, it's going to begin building up to a conjunction with Saturn in Aquarius in the same house in your chart, in the fifth house of children, creativity, and sex and sexuality. So that conjunction will go exact on April 4th and 5th, before eventually the transit will be over when Mars departs from Aquarius and moves into Pisces on April 14th. So I wanted to mention this because Mars um, moving into Aquarius and into your fifth house can indicate a period in which some of those issues that I was talking about become more urgent. So sometimes Mars transits through the fifth house or Mars transits in general can just increase the pace of events so that you're putting a lot of extra focus and a lot of extra energy and effort on this area of your life for some reason. So it can just indicate a period in which it becomes even more of a focal point in your life for about a month or so. However, for some people, Mars transits can increase the pace of things, but also bring issues with like conflict, with strife, or with severing and separations. So, for example, one scenario could be something like getting in a fight with one of your children and having an argument or something like that. Or alternatively, getting in some sort of quarrel with like a lover or something like that, which can be a fifth house type person or fifth house type transit. Generally speaking, it's just a period in which Mars and Saturn transits tend to pull you sometimes psychologically in two different directions, or where you feel like you're being pulled in two very different opposite directions, which can generally just cause some tension and some anxiety in that period of your life for a relatively brief span of time for about a month. So I wanted to point that out just because that seems to be part of the focal point of some of that Saturn transit that's happening this year is that Mars-Saturn conjunction, which looks a little bit tense since the last one what we had in that sign was around March and April of 2020. All right, so related to that slightly is Saturn is also squaring Uranus from your eighth house of other people's money off and on during the course of this year. So we already had 3 exact squares between Saturn and Uranus during the course of 2021. So that's one of the main long-term transits that we've had going on for quite a while now over the past 12 months. However, as we can see from this graph from Archetypal Explorer, it's actually going to come back again pretty close and pretty strong in the September-October timeframe, basically around the third quarter of 2022. So Uranus has been transiting through Taurus, which is your 8th house. And the 8th house represents, generally speaking, finances and money and assets that belong to other people. And Uranus transits tend to be very liberating. They tend to be very exciting. They tend to change things up and indicate radical, somewhat unexpected changes in the area of the life that Uranus is transiting. So this can be sudden financial changes, especially as it relates to the role that other people's money plays in your life. Because the way that it's set up is like the first house is you, the second house is your finances, the 7th house is other people, and the 8th house is other people's finances. So symbolically, the 8th house generally represents the financial matters or assets that belong to people other than you, but also the role that that plays in your life or how that comes into your life. So sometimes that can come up in different, sometimes weird ways through things like inheritances, topics of debt, taxes, donations. In some instances, since the second house is the second house, or the 8th house is the second relative to the 7th house of partnership, it can indicate your partner's finances. So in some instances, transits through the 8th house can indicate developments that are happening in terms of your partner's financial money-making potential or income or what have you, either positively or negatively. So I'm bringing up this transit because basically this has been part of an on and off theme that you've been experiencing over the course of the past year that will continue into this year of some sort of tension between the 8th house of other people's money and the 5th house of children, creativity, sex, and sexuality. So the square between Uranus and Saturn indicates some sort of tension in this area. If there's any sort of stressful relationships or connections between this area for some reason in your life, then some of these tensions could shake things up and cause things to sort of deteriorate, or if there are not very sound structures in this area of your life, it could cause some of them to fall if they're not very well laid foundations at this time, so that you'll have to build something up new in their place. Alternatively, it could just be a stress testing period where you go through a period where there are challenges or tensions that come up unexpectedly that shake the foundations. But if things are relatively strong and stable, then those foundations will stay solid and there will not be any major sort of losses or destruction in this area of your life at this time. But I wanted to mention this partially because it leads us into our next set of transits, which is that this year we have ramping up a series of eclipses in the signs of Taurus and Scorpio, which are your 8th and 2nd houses. So this is really, the 8th and 2nd houses are, in particular, it's the financial axis in our chart. So the 2nd house is our finances, our money, our income, and our possessions, whereas the 8th house represents the income and money and possessions of other people. So you're going to have eclipses bouncing back and forth in this axis of your life during the course of this year. And my primary keyword for eclipses is they tend to indicate major beginnings and major endings. So major beginnings and major endings when it comes to financial matters, both related to your own finances as well as the finances of other people in your life, including partners. So here's the dates for those eclipses. The first set of eclipses are going to take place in late April and early May. And then the second set of eclipses are going to happen from late October through early November. So those are the two primary time ranges. And eclipses tend to be catalysts for major events. And some of the most positive events in your life, as well as some of the most negative events, will tend to be foreshadowed by eclipses. So for you, because this is connected with some of the Uranus transit through your 8th house of other people's money, I think this is really tied into financial matters and some of the continued major radical changes taking place in your life when it comes to the role that other people's finances plays in your life personally and the personal effect that it has on your life and your birth chart. One other topic that sometimes comes up when it comes to 8th house transits that I have to mention is issues pertaining to mortality and longevity. So sometimes people can start thinking about their own mortality or making arrangements by thinking about things like life insurance or other things like that and making sure their loved ones are taken care of if something were to happen with them. In other instances, you can start thinking about the mortality of those around you or having that come up as a topic for some reason at this time when the 8th house starts getting activated. So sometimes it's a good idea to think about and plan out things like that ahead of time instead of being sort of surprised by it at some point in the future, having not made any plans for it in advance. So to whatever extent you can make constructive, positive changes in that part of your life or plans in that part of your life, it might be a useful thing to do or to think about. And that can sort of take up or soak up the symbolism of this, great endings and great beginnings signature that's happening in that part of your chart this year, just to use the symbolism constructively. All right, so there's one other transit I needed to mention, or I meant to mention this year, which is the Mars retrograde in the second half of the year that's happening in the sign of Gemini. So this is really going to begin on August 20th when the planet Mars moves into the sign of Gemini, which is your 9th house of religion, philosophy, travel, education. There's a lot of really positive 9th house topics, actually, as you can see from this diagram, but they generally have to do with exploring and learning things that are different or that are foreign compared to what you know or what you started with at the point at which you began in your early life. So this period begins on August 20th when Mars moves into that sign, but it really picks up and peaks in intensity around October 30th when Mars slows down and stations retrograde, and then begins moving backwards for a period of several months. So that's Mars right there. You can see it does sort of a U-turn. That U-turn will happen around October 30th, and then it'll move backwards in the sky, retracing its steps for several months. So, as I said earlier, Mars periods can be periods in which there's just greater focus and energy. In this instance, it could be a period in which you have to have sustained effort in pushing forward in this area of your life, even though it's taking much longer than you originally thought it would or originally planned it would. Mars transits through the ninth house could be sort of energetically exploring something or traveling or starting a new mode of education and learning about new things or foreign things, or really diving into a new philosophy or sort of religious study of some sort and sort of expanding your horizons in that way. So Mars transits can just be about putting a lot of energy and effort into something for a relatively short span of time of a few months. Possible downside that always comes up with Mars, as I said earlier, is that sometimes it can indicate conflict or discord or severing or separation in the part of the chart that it's transiting. So there could be some sort of conflict that comes up if you are traveling at this time, since the ninth house is one of the places of travel. It could be some sort of conflict or strife when it comes to education. So sometimes people are like on a certain educational path, but then something happens and they find themselves having to leave that or sort of reject or cut that out of their life for some reason. It can also be some sort of conflict in terms of your philosophy of life, or some sort of conflict in terms of your religious beliefs at this time, where there's something that comes up that causes you to have some sort of falling out with a belief system that you had previously, or some sort of reckoning where you find yourself separating from some previous sort of religious institution or religious beliefs. There's a lot of different scenarios, and the ninth house is is one of those houses that actually has a ton of significations. So it's hard to narrow things down too much in terms of the archetypes involved, but that should give you some idea of that as one of the last major transits that's kind of overshadowing a decent part of the second half of the year, especially once Mars stations from late October forward. And then that retrograde transit of Mars will continue on and won't actually wrap up until a little ways into 2023. So I think that's actually the last major transit that I wanted to mention as part of this report. I have touched on the Jupiter-Neptune, the Mars-Saturn conjunction, the Saturn-Uranus square, and I believe I showed this diagram for the Venus retrograde. So I think that is actually it for this forecast. So thanks for watching this forecast for 2022, and I'll see you again in 2023. All right, that's it for this horoscope forecast for 2022. So as always, this was just a general forecast that focuses on some of the broad outlines of the year ahead. So if you'd like a more detailed analysis of some of the general transits this year, then be sure to check out our year ahead forecast for 2022 that we released in December. Additionally, for a more detailed analysis of your chart, you might want to get a consultation with an astrologer, because they can look at it in much more detail than I can go into here in just a general horoscope. Alternatively, or better yet, you could also learn how to read your birth chart and transits on your own, which would allow you to pinpoint some of the dates involved with much more precision and exactness. So if you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you can get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune. And in this book, I reconstructed the original system of Western astrology and recovered some techniques that we had lost many centuries ago. So with this book, I sort of teach you how to read a birth chart and how to use different timing techniques in order to determine when different things will happen during the course of your life, or in some instances during the course of a single year, as I've attempted to do in this horoscope forecast. So the book is available on Amazon as well as in other fine bookstores everywhere. I also teach an online course on ancient astrology, which has over 100 hours of video lectures It shows hundreds of different example charts in order to show you how the different techniques work in practice. And it really gets into details that I couldn't go into as much in my book, even though the book is very big. In the course, I actually get into a lot more example charts, which really gives you better hands-on experience of how to use astrology to read birth charts in practice. So you can find out more information about that at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, I also recently released my 2022 electional astrology report, where I went through the year and I picked out some of the most auspicious or lucky dates with one lucky date or electional chart for each of the next 12 months. So these are useful for starting different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. The report is also available at courses.theastrologyschool.com. All right, so that's it. So thanks for watching. Good luck in 2022, and may the stars be ever in your favor. Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.